Welcome to the Enigma of the Embezzler's Equation, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series The Lost Cases of Young Sherlock, before Baker Street, playing in the year 1874. It is with a peculiar sense of discovery that I present these accounts, unearthed from the archives of Victor Trevor's ancestral estate, a collection of letters, journals, and Holmes's own university notebooks. They chronicle the period between 1872 and 1877, offering a rare glimpse into the formative investigations of a young Sherlock Holmes, long before our Baker Street days. These are the lost cases of young Sherlock, before Baker Street, revealing the nascent genius at work. From this remarkable collection, I shall now recount a most singular affair which first tested his burgeoning abilities. It is the curious matter I have titled The Enigma of the Embezzler's Equation. Chapter 1. On a chill November evening, the chambers of the Dilettante Detectives Club were usually a haven of comfortable, if sometimes misguided, enthusiasm. The low murmur of conversation, punctuated by the occasional rustle of a turning page or the distant clatter of hooves on the cobbled street below, formed a familiar symphony. I was observing young Mr. Armitage, who was earnestly recounting a rather mundane observation of a suspicious-looking lamplighter, when the door creaked open with unusual urgency. It was Mr. Victor Trevor, his face flushed, a copy of the Evening Standard clutched in his hand. The usual hum of the room subsided, heads turning towards him. Even Holmes, who had been staring into the fire with an air of profound abstraction, tilted his head slightly, a flicker of interest in his keen grey eyes. His voice was rather breathless. "Gentlemen, Holmes, have you seen this? A most singular affair in Cambridge," remarked Victor Trevor. He spread the paper upon the central table, its crisp pages rustling audibly as several members craned their necks. I, too, leaned forward. The headline was stark. "Bank clerk vanishes embezzlement, suspected A.T. London and County." Good heavens, Trevor. Embezzlement in Cambridge. What else does the Standard say of this Appledore? Commented Dr. John Watson. Mr. Armitage commented, his tone somewhat deflated by the interruption to his own narrative. "Ah, another unfortunate case of moral turpitude leading to fiscal malfeasance, I presume. These modern banking institutions, for all their supposed security, seem quite vulnerable to internal decay," answered Mr. Armitage. Trevor's voice rose with excitement as he jabbed his finger at a paragraph. "Ah, but there is more, Armitage, much more. The clerk, a Mr. Silas Appledore, left nothing behind save for, good heavens, a most peculiar mathematical equation scrawled upon his blotter," Victor Trevor said. At this, Holmes rose, his chair scraping faintly against the wooden floor, and strode to the table. The other members made way, their own curiosity now piqued by his sudden animation. He scanned the article, his brow furrowed in concentration. The only sounds in the sudden hush were the crackle of the fire and the faint, rhythmic tick-tock of the mantelpiece clock. His voice, when he finally spoke, was crisp and thoughtful. "An equation, you say? Not merely a random string of figures, but a structured mathematical problem," replied Sherlock Holmes. "Indeed, Holmes. The paper describes it as being of considerable complexity. The local constabulary are, of course, treating it as the ramblings of a disturbed mind, focusing their efforts on a manhunt," Victor Trevor replied. Holmes murmured, a hint of dry amusement in his tone. Naturally, when the conventional mind encounters the unconventional, it invariably dismisses it. An equation, gentlemen, is a message. It is precise. It is logical. An embezzler who leaves such a thing behind is either a fool of the highest order or a man of considerable and perhaps underestimated intellect. Sherlock Holmes said, "So you suspect, Holmes, that this equation is not the scrawling of a desperate man, but a calculated message," responded Dr. John Watson. The club members exchanged glances, their earlier chatter replaced by a more focused attention. the silence punctuated only by the gentle creak of floorboards as Holmes paced for a moment, his gaze distant. He began, his voice taking on a more directive edge. Your enthusiasm, gentlemen, could be of some utility here. While the deeper complexities of this matter may require a more specialized approach, preliminary inquiries are well within your purview. Mr. Finch, your family has connections in Cambridge, I believe. Some discreet questions regarding this Mr. Appledore's character and habits would not go amiss, explained Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Finch, a portly man with a nervous disposition, stammered. Why, yes, Holmes. My cousin is a Don at Trinity. I could certainly, responded Mr. Finch. Holmes added, with a faint smile that softened the barb, excellent. And Mr. Armitage, your keen eye for detail, though sometimes misapplied, might observe the environs of the bank, the general atmosphere. Note anything out of the ordinary, however trivial it may seem. But remember, gentlemen, you are observers, not interrogators. Discretion is paramount, declared Sherlock Holmes. The room fell silent as the heavy tread of boots echoed from the stairwell. Then came a series of authoritative raps upon the door, each knock reverberating through the chamber like a thunderclap. Recognizing the particular cadence of his arrival, I muttered, "That will be Constable Grimshaw, I expect." Dr. John Watson added. Indeed, the door was thrust open with a resounding crack that cut through the room's quiet anticipation, revealing the stout, uniformed figure of the constable. His face set in an expression of weary officialdom, he surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on Holmes with a distinct lack of warmth. His voice, when it came, was a low growl. Mr. Holmes, and your associates, I trust you're not planning on interfering with proper police procedure regarding this Cambridge business. We have it well in hand. Constable Grimshaw replied. Holmes replied, his tone mild. Constable Grimshaw, we are merely discussing the latest fascinating puzzle presented by our daily press. Idle speculation, you understand. However, should any pertinent facts inadvertently fall into our laps, rest assured, you shall be the first to know, stated Sherlock Holmes. Grimshaw grunted, clearly unconvinced, but seeing no immediate cause for action, he gave a curt nod and departed, his footsteps receding heavily down the stairs. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the room. One might think Constable Grimshaw would welcome your insights, Holmes, rather than bristle at the mere thought of them, asked Dr. John Watson. Once the sound of the street door closing below reached them, Holmes remarked, his skepticism is understandable, but it is precisely that which he dismisses, the equation that holds the key. Watson, this Appledore is no common thief. Trevor, your initial report was most astute. Tomorrow, you and I shall journey to Cambridge. We must see this equation for ourselves and speak with the bank manager, a Mr. Thurston, I believe. The game, as they say, is afoot, deduced Sherlock Holmes. A fresh wave of anticipation swept through me. Holmes was truly engaged. Cambridge. My mind conjured images of its ancient, cobbled streets, winding between the towering facades of colleges, the sound of solitary footsteps echoing in the narrow passages, the air often damp with river mist from the Cam, especially in these late autumn months. I pictured the gas lamps beginning to flicker to life along King's Parade, casting long shadows where students and dons hurried past, perhaps oblivious to the dark puzzle that had just ensnared one of their city's inhabitants. An intriguing investigation was about to unfold there, starting with the stark figures on a missing clerk's desk. Constable Grimshaw's blunt dismissal of our amateur collective had, if anything, only sharpened Holmes's interest in the Appledore affair. Thus, the following morning found us, Holmes, myself, and young Victor Trevor, one of the more astute members of our Dilettante Detectives Club, standing before the imposing stone edifice of the London and County Bank in Cambridge. A crisp autumn air bit at our cheeks. On the cobbled street, the clatter of horse-drawn omnibuses and the distant chime of a city clock provided a constant, bustling counterpoint to the gravity of our errand. Inside, the bank presented itself as a veritable cathedral of commerce. Sunlight, fractured by tall, arched windows, danced upon floating dust motes above the polished mahogany counters. A subdued symphony arose from the rhythmic clink of coinage and the rustle of ledgers, punctuated now and then by a discreet cough. We were soon ushered into the office of Mr. Gregory Thurston, the bank manager, a man whose starched collar appeared to mirror the very rigidity of his demeanor. His voice, when he spoke, was clipped, carrying a distinct note of agitation. "Mr. Holmes, I presume, and your associates. A most distressing business, this. Indeed, most distressing. Appledore. Of all people," Mr. Gregory Thurston answered. Holmes inclined his head, his keen gaze sweeping the confines of the office. "Indeed, Mr. Thurston, our purpose is to understand the circumstances more fully. Perhaps you could enlighten us regarding Mr. Appledore's demeanor in the days leading up to his, shall we say, departure," Sherlock Holmes said. "Quiet, always quiet," Thurston replied, his pen tapping a nervous rhythm against the desk. He paused, frowning. "Diligent, or so we thought, never a hint of impropriety. The man was, well, a clockwork mechanism. Punctual to a fault," Mr. Gregory Thurston replied. Victor Trevor, who had been observing the exchange with keen interest, now spoke, his tone respectful yet firm. "And the equation discovered upon his desk, Mr. Thurston, was that typical of his usual work? Did he often, to your knowledge, indulge in such complex mathematics during office hours?" Victor Trevor said. Thurston emitted a dry, rasping scoff. "Mathematics, you ask? Appledore was a clerk, sir, not some university academic. His duties involved sums, simple additions and subtractions, yes, but certainly nothing of that. That incomprehensible scrawl. Utterly baffling, I tell you, and a clear waste of the bank's valuable time, I might add," Mr. Gregory Thurston said. Holmes then expressed his desire to examine Appledore's workspace. We were subsequently led to a modest desk, one in a row of identical stations, where the air hung thick with the scent of old paper and ink. Beside an inkwell and a neatly arranged set of pens stood a single, unlit gas lamp. There, upon the blotter, lay the infamous equation, a series of complex symbols and figures, a stark and perplexing anomaly in this bastion of mundane routine. My friend bent low, his eyes narrowed in concentration, examining the desk with an intensity that seemed to absorb every minute, seemingly insignificant detail. "Observe carefully, Watson, and you too, Trevor. Note the chair. It is pushed back squarely, not thrust aside in haste. The pens are clean, the blotter relatively unstained, save for this singular, intricate piece of work. This scene does not speak of a flight of panic," remarked Sherlock Holmes. "So, you surmise he took his time, Holmes," I ventured. "As if he were merely completing a final task before departing for the day, quite unperturbed," commented Dr. John Watson. "Precisely so, my dear Watson," Holmes affirmed, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Absolutely no indication of a hurried or frantic departure," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He then ran a delicate, almost reverent, finger along the smooth edge of the desk drawer. "And consider this further," he continued, his voice dropping slightly as if sharing a confidence. "Mr. Appledore was evidently a man of methodical habits, even, it would seem, in his distractions. Notice the faint yet distinct wear on the linoleum just here." He pointed, beneath the right side of the desk. "It is the unmistakable mark of a foot that habitually tapped or rested in precisely that spot. A creature of profound habit, indeed." "A creature of habit, to be sure," I remarked, contemplating the implications. "Yet one possessing a mind clearly capable of straying to realms far beyond his ledgers, if that astonishing equation is any indication," Dr. John Watson commented. "And observe these indentations on the blotter, Holmes, directly around the equation itself. Trevor interjected, his voice quickening with the thrill of discovery as he pointed. Do they not suggest he pressed down with considerable force, as if to emphasize each and every symbol? Replied Victor Trevor. Precisely your point, young Trevor, Holmes commended. A deliberate statement, I concur, not a mere fleeting calculation. Now, let us ascertain what other secrets this unassuming desk might yet be persuaded to yield. Sherlock Holmes noted. Holmes's agile fingers meticulously explored the underside of the main drawer. Suddenly, with a faint, satisfying click, a shallow, hidden compartment sprang open. It was young Trevor, his eyes perhaps sharper for their youth, or simply quicker to the mark, who first spotted the slim, leather-bound notebook tucked neatly within. Holmes retrieved the notebook, his expression unreadable as he carefully opened its worn cover. His eyebrows rose incrementally as he leafed through page after page filled with equations, notes, and theorems, material far beyond the ken of a simple bank clerk. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and deeply thoughtful. It appears, gentlemen, that our Mr. Appledore possessed a mind of far greater complexity than his daily ledger-keeping would ever suggest. These are assuredly not the jottings of a mere common embezzler, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Thus, a new, intriguing layer had been added to the unfolding mystery, a profound depth that hinted at motives far beyond simple, avaricious greed. In the ensuing silence, the rhythmic ticking of the grand office clock seemed to underscore the weighty questions now hanging palpably in the air. Mr. Thurston may well believe his clerk was a simple man of simple habits, Holmes mused, closing the notebook with a decisive, almost theatrical snap. But these meticulously crafted notes speak of a different caliber of intellect altogether. Our next logical step, I firmly believe, must be to explore the very environment that nurtured such unexpectedly profound and hidden scholarship. We must, without delay, visit Mr. Appledore's lodgings, stated Sherlock Holmes. The mathematical scribblings we had unearthed from Silas Appledore's desk at the London and County Bank were, as Holmes had remarked, more than mere idle jottings. They hinted at a mind far deeper than his mundane clerical role suggested. Thus, it was with a keen sense of anticipation that we myself, Holmes, and from our small club, Mr. Victor Trevor and the ever-observant Mr. Alastair Finch, found ourselves before Appledore's lodgings. The house stood on a quiet, rather grey street in Bloomsbury. The clatter of our hansom receding down the cobbled lane left an almost palpable silence, broken only by the distant cry of a costermonger. The landlady, a Mrs. Higgins, for so she introduced herself, a woman somewhat flustered and garrulous, peered at us through a narrowly opened door. Well, I never. More gentlemen asking after poor Mr. Appledore. The police have been here, you know. Such a quiet man, I always said. Kept to himself, he did, answered Mrs. Higgins. Holmes, with his customary persuasive charm, soon gained us access. The rooms themselves were small, meticulously tidy, yet imbued with a certain scholarly austerity. A faint scent of old paper and black tea hung in the air. The floorboards creaked a mournful protest under our tread as we entered what was clearly Appledore's study. Observe, gentlemen, the character of this room. Orderly, yes, but not the order of a vacant mind. This is the precision of intense concentration. Sherlock Holmes responded. His gaze swept over the sparsely furnished chamber, a worn desk, a single oil lamp, and shelves groaning under the weight of books. Holmes was drawn to these shelves, his long fingers dancing lightly over their spines. I approached, noting the titles. Few works of fiction graced these shelves. Instead, I saw Gauss, Euler, Riemann, names that spoke of the most abstruse branches of mathematics. Good heavens, Holmes, these are hardly the reading matter of a typical bank clerk, replied Victor Trevor. Indeed, and note the well-worn spines, Holmes. These were not merely for show. They were clearly his constant companions, consulted often, responded Alastair Finch. Precisely, Trevor, and a keen observation, Finch. Our Mr. Appledore was, it appears, a connoisseur of the complex, a gourmand of the recondite. And here, Watson, we have something more personal, declared Sherlock Holmes. He held out a journal, its pages filled with a neat, cramped script, interspersed with yet more equations and arcane symbols. Holmes began to read passages aloud, his voice carefully neutral, yet the underlying passion of the writer was unmistakable. The entries spoke of frustration, of a brilliant intellect stifled by the drudgery of his daily employment. One passage, in particular, resonated with a poignant clarity. Listen to this. October the 12th. Another soul-crushing day balancing ledgers whilst the patterns of the primes sing their silent song in my head. If only there were one, just one, who could perceive the architecture I am building, the edifice of pure reason. To what end this toil, if its fruits are never to be tasted by a worthy peer? Sherlock Holmes noted. A profound silence followed his reading, broken only by the sigh of the wind in the chimney flue. The image of Silas Appledore, the quiet embezzler, was rapidly being replaced by that of a frustrated genius. One can almost feel the poor fellow's torment. To possess such a mind, yet be so utterly unappreciated, responded Victor Trevor. It is a poignant echo of many a scholar's lament, is it not? A mind brimming with discovery, yet starved for an audience capable of true appreciation, said Alastair Finch. So the equation left at the bank I began, the pieces starting to fall into place in my own mind, wondered Dr. John Watson. Was not merely a clue to the whereabouts of stolen lucre, Watson. It was a statement, a challenge, perhaps, a desperate plea from a mind starved of recognition, hoping that somewhere, someone of equal caliber might decipher his meaning, appreciate his artistry. This man did not flee merely to escape justice for theft. He fled, I suspect, towards an intellectual validation he could not find here, deduced Sherlock Holmes. Holmes paced the small room, the floorboards complaining anew. He stopped before the window, looking out onto the dreary street below. The first lamplighter was making his rounds, his pole creating a small, sputtering bloom of light in the gathering dusk. These journals reveal the inner man, his intellectual landscape, but they tell us little of his recent actions, his specific preparations for this flight. We understand the why to some extent, but not the how or the where to. We need to know his habits beyond these walls, Watson. Who saw him in the days leading up to his disappearance? Who observed his routines, his departures from them, deduced Sherlock Holmes. His gaze sharpened, and I knew that look. A new avenue of inquiry had opened, and already his mind was racing down it. The quiet street outside, with its everyday comings and goings, suddenly seemed to hold the key to our next step, our investigation into the peculiar disappearance of Mr. Silas Appledore and the curious equation he had left as his sole legacy, had by this stage led us from his surprisingly intellectual lodgings to the bustling heart of Cambridge. Holmes, whom I observed was visibly energized by the discovery of Appledore's hidden genius, felt certain that direct observation of the man's daily haunts might yield further clues. The air thrummed with the cries of a fruit seller proclaiming the ripeness of his peaches, the sharp clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby alley, and the general hubbub of commerce. A veritable hive of activity, Holmes, I remarked, navigating a particularly dense knot of shoppers. Do you truly expect to find a thread of Appledore's quiet life in this public tapestry? Remarked Dr. John Watson. My dear Watson, Holmes replied, his eyes already scanning the crowd. The most revealing patterns are often woven into the most commonplace fabric. We are here to observe, stated Sherlock Holmes. Thus, we found ourselves amidst the clamor of the market square, a place I always found a striking cacophony of vendors hawking their wares, and the intermittent rumble of iron-shod wheels over the cobblestones. Holmes, with his usual hawk-like acuity, seemed to my eyes to scan every face, every interaction, his head turning with bird-like quickness. The scent of roasting chestnuts mingled with the damp wool of the crowd. His gaze, however, soon settled upon a young woman selling posies of violets and primroses from a wicker basket at a somewhat quieter corner, near the thoroughfare leading, as I knew, towards the London and County Bank. "What is it, Holmes?" I inquired, following his fixed stare. "Have you spotted our man?" Dr. John Watson added. "Not Appledore, Watson, but perhaps someone of interest nonetheless," he murmured, his attention unwavering. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. I noted she was plainly dressed, yet there was an alertness in her posture, an unusual intensity in the way she observed the passers-by that struck me as out of keeping with her humble trade. The distant, rhythmic cry of a fishmonger and the clatter of a drayman's cart, I remember, provided a constant, earthy underscore to the scene, punctuated by the occasional bark of a stray dog. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and directed solely at me. "Observe the flower girl, Watson. An unusual stillness for one engaged in such a trade. Let us see what blossoms of information she may offer." We approached, the crunch of gravel under our boots a brief counterpoint to the market's hum. I watched as Holmes, doffing his hat with a courtesy that seemed to momentarily surprise the young woman, inquired about her flowers. She responded in a soft, somewhat breathy voice, the accent common enough to my ear, yet her eyes, clear and intelligent, met his with a steadiness I found quite remarkable. "We are making some inquiries concerning a gentleman who frequented this area, a Mr. Silas Appledore of the nearby bank. Perchance you have noted him," Sherlock Holmes said. I observed a flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or was it caution, cross her features before she quickly smoothed them. Her voice was quiet but distinct, though a nearby street musician's melancholy fiddle tune almost masked her first words. "Mr. Appledore." "Aye, sir, the quiet gentleman, always punctual, always with a book beneath his arm. He passed this way each morning, regular as clockwork, and again at luncheon," answered Miss Rose Thorne. Her observations, I thought, were remarkably precise, certainly more detailed than one might expect from a casual vendor. Holmes listened intently, his head tilted slightly, a faint smile playing about his lips. As he considered her words, a gust of wind briefly rustled the awning of a nearby stall, carrying the scent of fresh bread. "She seems to have paid him particular attention, Holmes," I murmured, and aside as Miss Thorne paused, remarked Dr. John Watson. "Most particular, Watson," he replied quietly, before turning back to the flower girl, declared Sherlock Holmes. He spoke with a gentle sharpness, his voice cutting cleanly through the low murmur of the market. "You have a keen eye for detail, miss," Holmes prompted, his tone a mixture of curiosity and subtle challenge. Observed Sherlock Holmes. "Thorne, sir, Rose Thorne. One sees a great deal, standing here day after day," replied Miss Rose Thorne. "Indeed. And your hands, Miss Thorne, they have seen more of ink and fine paper than of the damp earth required for tending these delicate blooms, I fancy. And your speech, though carefully modulated, possesses a precision that suggests an educated mind. This is no mere happenstance, your meticulous watch upon Mr. Appledore," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. At Holmes's words, the young woman's composure visibly faltered. I saw it clearly. A blush rose to her cheeks, and her gaze dropped to the violets in her basket. Even the cheerful call of a distant newsboy hawking the evening paper seemed to fade as a new, palpable tension filled the small space between us. Her voice, when she spoke again, had lost its feigned simplicity, revealing a more cultured tone, though it trembled slightly. The change was as distinct as if a different person had spoken. "You are most perceptive, sir. It is true. I am not merely a seller of flowers. I had reason to observe Mr. Appledore. I knew of him, you see, from other circles. Mathematical circles, to be precise. His intellect was notable, even if unrecognized by his employers," replied Miss Rose Thorne. Holmes nodded slowly, and I saw his eyes gleam with that familiar spark of keen interest. A low escaped his lips, a sound I recognized as the precursor to a significant revelation. I recognized this at once. It was precisely the sort of unusual development that so often heralded a break in his cases. The flower girl's disguise, her prior knowledge of Appledore's intellectual pursuits. These, I felt certain, were no mere coincidences. He seemed troubled, sir, in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, more distracted than usual. He once dropped a page of calculations near my stall. The symbols were complex, far beyond mere accounting. I suspected he was engaged in some profound work, perhaps under great strain, remarked Miss Rose Thorne. This intelligence, I immediately grasped, was vital. It painted a picture of Appledore not as a common embezzler, but as a man wrestling with intellectual burdens, a theory that aligned perfectly with our findings at his lodgings. So, Holmes, I ventured. The equation was perhaps a product of this profound work she mentions, not merely a clue to stolen funds, asked Dr. John Watson. Precisely, Watson, or perhaps both. The human mind is a complex engine capable of intertwining the desperate with the divine, remarked Sherlock Holmes. His words resonated with my own burgeoning conviction. The equation left behind, I now felt more strongly than ever, was clearly no mere doodle. Holmes's voice, now keen and devoid of its earlier gentleness, cut through to the heart of the matter. The sounds of a nearby child's laughter, momentarily piercing the market's drone, seemed to cease as he spoke. Miss Thorne, your acquaintance with Mr. Appledore, your evident understanding of his capabilities, tell me, what precisely were your suspicions? And what led you to maintain such a dedicated vigil under this guise? Deduced Sherlock Holmes. I watched Miss Thorne hesitate, her fingers twisting a stray ribbon on her basket. A horse whinnied sharply from the street, and the scent of damp straw wafted over. The answer, I sensed with growing anticipation, would unlock another layer of this perplexing affair. Take your time, Miss Thorne, Holmes said, his voice surprisingly gentle once more. But understand, the truth is paramount, replied Sherlock Holmes. His encouragement seemed to steady her. Her next words, I felt quite certain, would significantly shape the path of our inquiry, and perhaps provide the very key Holmes needed to approach the baffling equation Appledore had left. I feared he was becoming entangled in something dangerous, sir. The calculations I glimpsed, they were not merely theoretical. They had a practical, almost desperate edge to them. I worried he might be using his brilliance to devise a system, perhaps for illicit gain, or that someone else was compelling him to do so. He spoke once, in a rare moment of candor at a society meeting, of the tyranny of numbers in the wrong hands, and his recent demeanor suggested he was wrestling with such a tyranny himself. Miss Rose Thorne replied. Miss Thorne's revelations spurred Holmes to new heights of concentration. Back in his university rooms, he was utterly consumed by Appledore's scrawled equation. The study crackled with his intense focus. Only the scratching of his pen and occasional sharp breaths broke the silence. Page after page he covered with spidery calculations, brow furrowed, lips moving silently. A low fire grumbled in the hearth, its shadows dancing with Holmes's frenetic energy. The scent of strong tobacco, his usual companion in thought, mingled with the dry aroma of ancient tomes. Confound it! A pattern deliberately obscured. It eludes conventional approaches, Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes's voice was tight with concentration. Victor Trevor of Christ's College, whose placid temperament often provided a foil to Holmes's volatile genius, had joined us. Trevor observed my friend with patient curiosity, the rustle of his newspaper a soft counterpoint to Holmes's restless energy. A Cardano grill, or rather, Watson Trevor, a most ingenious variation upon it. See here the distribution of these prime numbers, the seemingly random positioning of these algebraic symbols. It is not chaos, but a meticulously constructed veil, Sherlock Holmes said. He spoke with sudden, sharp animation, eyes gleaming, and thrust a sheet of paper towards Trevor, covered in his deductions. Appledore is no mere absconding clerk with a penchant for petty theft. This equation, gentlemen, is the work of a mind of considerable mathematical acuity. He has adapted Cardano's principle, using not a physical grill, but a conceptual one, keyed to a sequence only he or someone of equal mathematical insight would readily discern, stated Sherlock Holmes. Indeed, Holmes, the complexity is quite formidable. Even with your identification of the underlying principle, the specific key, it is not immediately apparent, responded Victor Trevor. Trevor's tone was thoughtful, his gaze fixed on the challenging symbols. For another hour, Holmes grappled with the puzzle. His initial triumph faded to grim determination. In the silence, the mantelpiece clock grew louder, each tick measuring Appledore's stubborn cipher. Outside, a distant university bell chimed mournfully on the grey afternoon air. The variables, Trevor. There are too many interdependent variables. I can see the structure, the elegance of its design, but to unlock the precise sequence required to decrypt it fully, it is like trying to pick a lock with 1,000 tumblers, each requiring a unique turn, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes's voice, usually confident, now held rare frustration. I had seldom seen him so thoroughly checked. His rapid deductions met a barrier his vast knowledge could not surmount. He paced the small study like a caged tiger, glaring at the equation as if to will its secrets forth. No, this requires more than general brilliance. This is the domain of a specialist, a mind steeped not merely in mathematics, but in its most abstract and theoretical realms. My own understanding, I confess, reaches its limit here, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He stopped his pacing abruptly, his voice regaining some of its customary decisiveness. There are, of course, several men of considerable mathematical prowess within the university, Holmes. Professor Atherton, perhaps, or young Moriarty, responded Victor Trevor. He offered the names with a slight lift of his eyebrows. Moriarty, you say? Yes, the name is familiar. He has published some rather startling papers on binomial theorem, if I recall. A mind of the first order by all accounts, though perhaps unorthodox. Very well, Trevor. It seems our next port of call must be to solicit the aid of a professor of mathematics. This equation will not yield to brute force alone. It demands a kindred intellect, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes's tone was firm, the path forward now clear. Our hunt for the truth in Appledore's baffling equation would lead us into higher academia. I confess, the prospect of Holmes collaborating with a renowned mathematician was intriguing, though I little knew then the profound consequences of that consultation. True to his word, Holmes had made inquiries. The following afternoon found us threading our way through the hallowed quadrangles of an esteemed university. The scent of aged parchment and chalk dust grew stronger as we ascended a broad, echoing stone staircase to the office of Professor James Moriarty, a mathematician Holmes had identified as possessing a prodigious, if youthful, reputation. A quiet knock on a heavy oak door admitted us to a room lined floor to ceiling with forbidding volumes. Before a vast desk, cluttered with papers and intricate wire models, sat Professor Moriarty. He was surprisingly lean, younger than I had pictured, with a high, pale forehead and eyes of singular reptilian stillness. His voice, as he acknowledged us with a slight nod, was remarkably soft, yet each word held unnerving precision. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume," remarked Professor James Moriarty. Moriarty's soft voice carried a note of curiosity. "Your reputation precedes you, even into these somewhat cloistered halls. To what do I owe the honor?" responded Professor James Moriarty. Holmes replied, his tone equally measured. "Professor Moriarty, your own is not unknown to me. I come to you on a matter of some complexity, requiring an intellect versed in the higher forms of mathematics. A realm, I confess, where my own proficiencies find their limit, explained Sherlock Holmes. Holmes laid out the Appledore case, producing the enigmatic equation. Professor Moriarty listened without interruption, gaze fixed upon the paper, his long, pale fingers steepled. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock from the hallway, its solemn beat underscoring the gravity of our consultation. Professor Moriarty spoke again, his voice holding a note of detached academic interest. Ingenious. A variation, as you've no doubt surmised, of a grill cipher, but with a rather elegant number-theoretic overlay. The work of a mind both disciplined and, I should venture, profoundly frustrated, replied Professor James Moriarty. Holmes asked, his eyes narrowing. Frustrated, Professor, Sherlock Holmes responded. Moriarty permitted himself the faintest of smiles, a fleeting expression that did little to warm his features. Indeed, to possess such a capacity for abstract thought, only to be tethered to the mundane drudgery of a bank clerk's ledger, it speaks of a significant internal pressure. This equation, Mr. Holmes, is not merely a key. It is a manifesto of suppressed intellect, remarked Professor James Moriarty. He tapped a section of the complex figures with a slender finger. The particular sequence here suggests an affinity with the work of certain continental theorists, a rather niche group, not widely acknowledged in our more conservative institutions, answered Professor James Moriarty. Holmes said, his voice carefully neutral. Your insight is invaluable, Professor. This specific reference to continental theorists is a most significant pointer. It suggests our Mr. Appledore was not working in an intellectual vacuum, Sherlock Holmes said. Moriarty replied, with a slight shrug. Genius often seeks its own level, Mr. Holmes, sometimes in the most unexpected of places. The practical application of such an intellect, however, is another matter entirely. This Appledore, he has merely applied his to a rather pedestrian crime. Imagine what such a mind could achieve if directed towards truly grand designs, remarked Professor James Moriarty. A subtle emphasis on grand designs sent a chill down my spine. As we took our leave, the heavy door sighed shut, and our footsteps echoed loudly in the corridor's sudden silence. Holmes remained uncharacteristically pensive during our journey back towards Baker Street. Gas lamps cast their mellow glow upon dampening pavements, a light drizzle hissing softly against the rumble of carriage wheels. Holmes spoke at last, his voice thoughtful. A remarkable mind, Watson, truly remarkable, and one, I suspect, that operates upon a plane entirely of its own devising. His mention of those continental theorists, it opens a new avenue. Appledore may have found kinship, or at least inspiration, amongst others who felt their talents similarly unrecognized. We must explore that, deduced Sherlock Holmes. The unease Moriarty planted in my mind seemed to take root in Holmes's too, though his focus remained, as ever, on the case's practical implications. I knew then our investigation was about to take another, more intricate turn. Professor Moriarty's disquieting pronouncements still echoed in my mind. Meanwhile, Holmes paced our Baker Street lodgings, his steps charged with renewed intensity, his slippered feet making a rhythmic tap, tap, tap upon the floorboards. For a long while, this was the only sound, save for the distant, mournful chime of a Westminster clock striking the late hour. The very air in the room, thick with the scent of his strong tobacco, seemed charged with his unspoken thoughts, heavy and expectant. Watson, Holmes said, his voice cutting through the silence, consider the singular nature of Appledore's equation. Its sheer complexity, as Moriarty pointed out, tells us much, remarked Sherlock Holmes. I looked up from the rustling pages of the evening paper, considering his words. The equation was indeed no simple scrawl, but a testament to a profound mathematical intellect. Such a construction, he continued, pausing by the mantelpiece, his shadow dancing in the flickering gaslight, points not to the crude artifice of a common fugitive, but to a mind seeking resonance, perhaps even a posthumous acknowledgment from its intellectual brethren. Observed Sherlock Holmes. Before I could fully digest Holmes's pronouncement, a series of distinct, if somewhat hesitant, knocks sounded at our door, a sharp rap, then two softer taps, echoing slightly in the hallway beyond. It was the appointed hour. I moved to the heavy oak panel, and upon opening it with a slight creak, was met by the members of our informal Dilettante Detectives Club, whom Holmes had summoned. The scent of damp wool from their coats, and the faint, scholarly aroma of old books preceded them into the room, mingling with the lingering pipe smoke. Their faces, illuminated by the gaslight from the hall, showed a mixture of eagerness and respectful anticipation. Holmes addressed them with a brisk nod, his tone businesslike, cutting through the low murmur of their arrival. Gentlemen, your unique access to the various strata of Cambridge society will be invaluable. We seek evidence of a particular intellectual climate. I do not believe Mr. Appledore acted within a formal conspiracy, but rather was influenced by a shared sentiment of frustration amongst unrecognized talents. Your task is to uncover traces of this collective discontent, Sherlock Holmes responded. And so, for several days, the members of our little club dispersed throughout Cambridge. Their footsteps would soon be heard echoing in ancient quadrangles. The dry rustle of fallen autumn leaves a constant whisper underfoot as they pursued their inquiries. I imagined them navigating the often austere, paneled rooms of various mathematical society meeting halls, perhaps within the older colleges, where the air hung thick with the scent of aged wood, beeswax, and the faint, dry aroma of chalk dust. The hushed, lofty interiors would be dominated by long, polished tables, scarred by generations of fervent discussion, and walls lined with portraits of past luminaries. From behind heavy, closed doors, the low, earnest murmur of debate would occasionally seep out fragments of arguments over esoteric theorems, the rhythmic tap of a lecturer's pointer against a blackboard, or the collective sigh of understanding from an engrossed audience. Beyond these halls, they delved into dusty college archives, the silence broken only by the soft turning of brittle pages and the occasional distant cough. Even the more obscure public houses, thick with the smell of stale ale and tobacco smoke, where academics sometimes gathered, were not beneath their scrutiny. The clatter of tankards and the low hum of conversations would have been the backdrop to their discreet questions. It was young Mr. Cecil Tillinghast, a junior fellow with a keen ear for university gossip, who returned with the most promising gleanings. His boots scraped lightly on the threshold as he entered, and he laid out a collection of notes before Holmes, his voice earnest, if a little breathless from his haste. "Mr. Holmes, your instincts were, as ever, unerring. We have found not direct collusion, but pamphlets, minutes from informal gatherings, even letters exchanged." The papers rustled as he indicated them, all resonating with a distinct pattern of intellectual dissatisfaction and thwarted ambition. Appledore's name appears sporadically, a sympathizer it would seem, rather than an instigator, answered Mr. Cecil Tillinghast. Holmes examined the proffered documents, a thin smile playing upon his lips. The crackle of the papers was sharp in the otherwise quiet room, each sheet turned with deliberate care. "Precisely, Mr. Tillinghast." Holmes's voice was thoughtful, his gaze fixed on the documents. Appledore was not an island. This undercurrent of shared ambition, of brilliance chafing against mundane confines, provided the fertile ground for his desperate gamble. He sought not merely escape, but a form of intellectual vindication amongst those he felt would understand, replied Sherlock Holmes. The pieces of the puzzle were indeed beginning to form a more coherent, if tragic, picture. The scent of old paper and ink from the documents Tillinghast provided seemed to underscore the intellectual nature of the affair. The equation was more than a clue. It was a cri de coeur, aimed at a very specific audience. Appledore's motivations, once opaque, were now imbued with a pathetic clarity. Holmes rose, the sudden movement causing his chair to scrape faintly against the floorboards. His gaze was distant for a moment before sharpening with renewed purpose. And yet, one thread remains conspicuously loose, one that may tie the abstract to the concrete. The flower girl, Miss Rose Thorne. Her initial observations, dismissed by the constabulary as irrelevant, now acquire a new significance in light of Appledore's character. We must speak with her again, Watson, and with more pointed inquiry. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. A new avenue of investigation had opened. The crackle of the fire in the hearth seemed to echo the quickening of my own pulse as I confessed. The prospect of revisiting the enigmatic Miss Thorne, armed with this deeper understanding of Appledore's world, filled me with a distinct sense of anticipation for what revelations might next unfold. Following Holmes's enigmatic summons, I found myself accompanying him to a quiet, almost forgotten alcove within the sprawling university grounds. Ancient stone walls, draped with ivy, formed a natural enclosure, and the only sounds were the rustle of dry leaves underfoot as a chill autumn wind sighed through the skeletal branches overhead, and the distant, melodic chime of a college clock. Holmes stood, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the path by which we had come. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and thoughtful. Our witness should arrive presently, Watson. A young woman of considerable resilience, I suspect, and one whose true role in this affair has, until now, remained veiled. Sherlock Holmes noted. Indeed, a slender figure soon emerged from the shadows of the arched walkway, clutching a small, worn satchel. It was the flower girl, Miss Thorne, though today she carried no basket of blooms. Her steps were hesitant on the gravel, the crunching sound seeming loud in the stillness. She looked smaller somehow, without her colorful wares, and a certain weariness was etched upon her young face. Her voice was quiet, a mere breath of sound. "Mr. Holmes, you sent for me," Miss Rose Thorne answered. "I did, Miss Thorne, or perhaps I should say, Miss Thorne, student of mathematics," Sherlock Holmes said. The girl started, her eyes widening, and a flush rose to her cheeks. For a moment, she seemed poised for flight, but then a different expression settled upon her features, a dawning comprehension, mixed with a hint of resignation. The hand clutching her satchel tightened. He continued, his tone not unkind, but relentlessly direct. "Your observations of Mr. Appledore were astute, remarkably so for a common flower vendor. Yet it was not the petals you studied, but the man," replied Sherlock Holmes. Miss Thorne listened intently, her composure strained but holding. "Your hands, Miss Thorne, bear the faint, telltale smudges of graphite and ink, not the ingrained earth of a florist. And the book you inadvertently dropped during our first brief encounter, Legenders, Elements of Geometry, is hardly typical reading for one in your purported profession." She drew a steadying breath, her voice now firmer, tinged with a quiet dignity. "It is true, sir," she admitted, her voice gaining strength. "My circumstances force me to be economical with the truth about my daily life, but my studies, they are my own affair," Miss Rose Thorne replied. Holmes nodded, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. The wind carried the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a mournful perfume for this revelation. "Indeed, and it is precisely your understanding of such affairs, particularly those of a mathematical nature, that I now require. You knew Silas Appledore not merely as a customer, but as a fellow intellect, did you not?" Sherlock Holmes noted. Her gaze became distant, reflective as she began. "Mr. Appledore, he often spoke, not to me directly as a confidant, but aloud, as one wrestling with complex thoughts. He would mutter equations, trace patterns in the air," answered Miss Rose Thorne. I observed Holmes lean forward slightly, his keen interest palpable in the quiet alcove. Miss Thorne continued, her voice tinged with a melancholic understanding. I recognized the torment of a mind grappling with concepts far beyond his daily ledger. He once mentioned his fascination with Diaphantine equations, their elegant simplicity hiding profound depths. He felt the world saw only the clerk, never the scholar within. Miss Rose Thorne replied. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Diaphantine equations, he breathed, the words igniting his thoughts like a spark to tinder. Replied Sherlock Holmes. These weren't mere sums, but intricate algebraic puzzles, a critical detail revealing Appledore's true mathematical passion. Of course, the man was not merely leaving a random scrawl, Watson, but a challenge framed in the language he most revered, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He then turned his full attention to Miss Thorne, his expression alight with the thrill of discovery. Miss Thorne, Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes stated, his voice now charged with conviction. Your insight into his specific intellectual passion is invaluable. It suggests the very structure, the very soul of the cipher he has left behind, observed Sherlock Holmes. I saw then how Appledore's act was not simply one of embezzlement, but a desperate, intellectual flourish. A cry for recognition from a world he felt had dismissed his true worth. Miss Thorne's testimony painted him not as a common thief, but as a tragic figure. He was akin to the frustrated intellects we had encountered in past cases, yet driven to a more dramatic and personal form of rebellion. His attention returned fully to the young woman, a rare warmth in his tone. You have provided the missing piece, Miss Thorne, the key to understanding the mind behind the equation. Appledore sought an audience capable of appreciating his art. It seems he shall have one, explained Sherlock Holmes. With this new, vital understanding of Appledore's mathematical leanings, Holmes seemed re-energized. The path to deciphering the embezzler's curious message, once so obscure, now appeared to possess a discernible, if challenging, direction. Indeed, the final assault on the equation itself felt imminent, and I anticipated our next move with keen expectation. The revelations imparted by Miss Thorne had cast a new, almost sympathetic light upon the enigmatic Mr. Appledore. Holmes, energized by this fresh perspective, had returned to the complex equation with renewed vigor. Our shared rooms at the university, usually a haven of quiet contemplation, were now electric with the silent hum of his focused intellect. For hours, the only sounds had been the frantic scratch of his pen upon foolscap, the rustle of his notes, and the occasional, sharp intake of breath that signaled a new avenue of thought. Outside, the wind soughed a mournful tune against the ancient leaded panes, a fitting accompaniment to the intricate puzzle before him. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was taut with a suppressed excitement. Eureka, Watson, or rather its mathematical equivalent. The final lark has yielded, Sherlock Holmes said. I started from my perusal of the Strand, my own mind having wandered far from the intricacies of Appledore's arithmetic. Holmes was on his feet, his tall, gaunt figure pacing before the fireplace, the sheet of paper bearing the infamous equation clutched in one hand, now almost entirely obscured by his own spidery annotations. The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating the keen triumph in his eyes. He paused, his gaze sweeping over his handiwork. Miss Thorne was undeniably correct in her assessment of Appledore's psyche. This was never merely about the pilfered shillings and pence, Watson. It was a cri de coeur, an intellectual gauntlet thrown down to a world he felt had tragically undervalued him. He gestured towards the paper, its surface a battlefield of numbers and symbols. The original, neat figures of Appledore were now surrounded by Holmes's own rapid, angular script, forming connections and pathways I could scarcely comprehend. The faint scent of the cheap ink Appledore must have used mingled with the sharper aroma of Holmes's own preferred blend. Appledore, you see, grounded his cipher not in some obscure, invented system, but within the elegant framework of number theory. He used modular arithmetic, Watson, combined with a personal key derived from prime number sequences, a subject he studied obsessively. His true ingenuity, or rather, his deliberate challenge, was to link the very core of this system, the main number used for his calculations, to a seemingly unrelated figure from one of his own unpublished papers. Miss Thorne's recollection of his bookshelf provided the crucial link to that paper. It was a vanity, Watson, but a brilliant one. My companion then proceeded, with painstaking clarity, to unravel the steps. He demonstrated how Appledore had cleverly disguised his message using these numerical relationships and the specific sequence of numbers, each deduction building upon the last until the entire edifice of the cipher stood exposed. It was less about reciting complex formulae and more about following Appledore's unique logical pathway. Finally, with a flourish of his pen, he transcribed the decoded message onto a fresh sheet. His voice held a note of profound satisfaction. The funds, some £500, are concealed within a hollowed-out volume of Euler's Introductio in Analysis Infinitorum, third from the left, top shelf, in the mathematics section of the university library, a place he knew would be both sacrosanct and overlooked. But it is what accompanies that revelation which truly illuminates the man, Watson, replied Sherlock Holmes. Holmes then read aloud from what he termed Appledore's manifesto. As I listened, I was struck by the document's astonishing clarity and profound bitterness. Here was no common criminal's confession, but the lament of a betrayed scholar, a genius stifled by the mundane world around him. He detailed his intellectual frustrations, his disdain for a society that prized ledgers over learning, and his burning desire for his work, his true self, to be recognized, if only by a single discerning mind. Holmes lowered the paper, his expression thoughtful. He concludes thus: let this equation stand as my true legacy. Should any mind possess the acuity to pierce its veil, they will find not only the temporal dross I was forced to purloin, but the testament of a spirit that yearned for the infinite. To that mind I offer not an apology, but a kinship. His words, Watson, are a direct challenge, deduced Sherlock Holmes. A silence fell upon the room, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. The image of Silas Appledore, the absconded clerk, had transformed utterly. No longer a mere embezzler, he was now a figure of tragic complexity, a mind whose brilliance had curdled into a desperate act of defiance and, paradoxically, communication. Holmes broke the silence, his tone now brisk and decisive. The intellectual puzzle is solved, and a most fascinating one it has proven to be. Appledore's desire for a worthy successor has been met, though perhaps not in the manner he envisioned. Now, Watson, our task shifts. We must locate Mr. Appledore himself. This manifesto, this cry for understanding, also hints at a man unlikely to flee to common refuge, explained Sherlock Holmes. He was already reaching for his coat, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a new chase. The distant chime of the university clock, striking the late hour, echoed through the quiet study. The riddle of the equation was solved, but the hunt for its architect was only just beginning. I knew then that the night was far from over, and that Holmes was already formulating his next move. As pale dawn replaced the flickering gaslight of Baker Street, Holmes finally rose, his eyes still bright with the thrill of the decrypted cipher. He announced Appledore's sanctuary, and the stolen funds were now clear. Constable Grimshaw, summoned by a late-night wire, soon arrived, his heavy tread on the stairs announcing his presence. The constable appeared eager, if, like myself, bewildered by the case's labyrinthine nature. Holmes began, his voice crisp and devoid of fatigue. Constable, our quarry has not fled to the usual dens of iniquity. He seeks refuge amongst his own kind, the abstract thinkers. We journey to Elmsworth Study, a private retreat for scholars near Haslemere. Sherlock Holmes responded. Our journey south was swift. The train's rhythmic clatter gave way to the clip-clop of horses' hooves as we hired a trap. The air grew cleaner, tinged with damp earth and pine. Birdsong filled the quiet lanes, a stark contrast to the city's cacophony. Constable Grimshaw, however, seemed ill at ease in such pastoral tranquillity. Grimshaw grumbled, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate with his skepticism. A study, you say, Mr. Holmes, a peculiar place for a thief to hide. One would think he'd be halfway to America by now, not scribbling sums. Constable Grimshaw replied. A faint, knowing smile played on Holmes's lips as he corrected the constable. Ah, but Appledore is no common thief, Constable. His treasures are of the mind, and his flight is as much a statement as an escape. He believes himself beyond the reach of mundane pursuit, within a fortress of intellect, declared Sherlock Holmes. Elmsworth's study was a rambling, ivy-clad manor, nestled deep within ancient trees. A profound, almost unsettling silence hung over it, broken only by the wind sighing in the branches and the distant, methodical tap of a woodpecker. The gravel crunched softly under our boots as we approached, the sound overloud in the stillness. Holmes paused at the imposing oaken door, his keen gaze sweeping the facade. I watched as he absorbed every detail. No sign of hurried entry or departure, Sherlock Holmes noted. He murmured this more to himself than to either Grimshaw or me. His eyes then fixed upon an upper window. The curtains of that upper window are drawn, yet a faint light glows from within. Our man is likely still at his labors, undisturbed, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Then he pointed to a faint, yet distinct, trail of chalk dust, leading from a side path towards what appeared to be a less used entrance. He prefers not to be interrupted, it would seem, Sherlock Holmes said. Following Holmes, we entered through the side door, its hinges groaning. A startled housekeeper directed us to a secluded wing. The corridor, lined with closed doors, held an academic hush, a silence of intense concentration. From behind one door, we heard the faint, rhythmic scratching of a pen. Holmes nodded, and Grimshaw, jaw set, pushed the door open. The scene within was remarkable. Silas Appledore sat at a vast desk buried under papers, books, and remnants of sandwiches. Utterly absorbed, brow furrowed, his pen flew across a sheet of dense equations. So profound was his focus. Our unceremonious entrance, the sound of the door, went unnoticed, lost in his calculations. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, ink, and stale tea, the aroma of scholarly obsession. You are under arrest for the embezzlement of funds from the London and County Bank, Constable Grimshaw said. Appledore's pen paused, the sudden stillness startling. He slowly lifted his head, as if surfacing from deep waters. His eyes, focusing on us, held no fear, but those of a scholar interrupted at a crucial juncture. A profound weariness was etched on his features, yet an intense light burned within his eyes. A faint ink smudge adorned his cheek, a badge of his toil. When Appledore finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly mild, almost detached, tinged only with a hint of scholarly impatience rather than any alarm. Constable, Holmes, is it? You are premature. I am on the verge of a significant breakthrough, replied Mr. Silas Appledore. Holmes stepped forward. I noted his expression was one of keen, almost academic, interest rather than condemnation. A breakthrough, Mr. Appledore. Perhaps one even more significant than your rather elegant solution to the bank's porous security, explained Sherlock Holmes. The room in which we found Silas Appledore was less a fugitive's bolt hole and more the sanctuary of a scholar. Books and papers were piled high upon every surface, equations scrawled upon loose sheets with an almost feverish intensity. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and ink, and a low fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced with the single oil lamp illuminating the scene. Appledore himself, a slight man with eyes that burned with an unnatural light, regarded Holmes with a curious lack of alarm. Constable Grimshaw, by contrast, stood panting by the door, his hand twitching near his truncheon. His voice cut the silence, calm and measured. "Mr. Silas Appledore, I presume. Your calculations were most elaborate," declared Sherlock Holmes. Appledore inclined his head, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. His own voice, when it came, was surprisingly steady, devoid of the tremor one might expect from a cornered man. "You solved it, then, Mr. Holmes. I confess, I had hoped my little problem would find its way to an intellect capable of appreciating its nuances," replied Mr. Silas Appledore. Constable Grimshaw shifted impatiently, his boot scraping on the bare wooden floorboards. His gruff voice interrupted. "Enough of this fancy talk. You're under arrest for embezzlement, Appledore," replied Constable Grimshaw. Holmes raised a hand, a gesture that stilled even the irate constable. "Patience, Constable. I believe Mr. Appledore has more to tell us. That equation, sir, was no mere calculation. It was a statement, was it not?" "A challenge," remarked Sherlock Holmes. Appledore's eyes gleamed with a fervent light. He rose, pacing the small space between a teetering stack of journals and his cluttered desk. "A challenge, indeed, Mr. Holmes, and more a key. I toiled not in obscurity to be remembered as a common thief. No, that cipher was crafted with purpose. To ensure my life's work, my manifesto, would find its way to a mind capable of grasping its significance, not to be dismissed by lesser intellects as mere ravings," responded Mr. Silas Appledore. His voice gained strength, resonating with a passion that was almost unnerving. "For years I presented theories, offered insights that could revolutionize entire fields. And what was my reward? The condescending pat on the head, the advice to stick to my ledgers," answered Mr. Silas Appledore. Appledore paused, his breath coming faster, his slight frame seeming to vibrate with suppressed indignation. He took an agitated turn about the small room, his worn boots scuffing against the bare floorboards, narrowly avoiding a stack of precariously balanced books. "The funds I acquired," he hesitated for the briefest of moments, his eyes darting towards the door where Grimshaw stood, then his conviction returned, stronger than before. "They are not for personal gain. They are to fuel research that the establishment is too blind, too timid to support." His gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the confines of the dusty room, as if envisioning the very future he described, a future built upon his stolen shillings. "A new era of understanding, Mr. Holmes, and they would have me tally shillings," said Mr. Silas Appledore. I watched Holmes. His expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed on Appledore. There was no condemnation there, but rather an intense, analytical scrutiny. "And this manifesto, it details these revolutionary concepts. And your grievances, no doubt," explained Sherlock Holmes. Appledore moved to his cluttered desk and gestured towards a thick, leather-bound volume that lay amidst the chaos of papers. His tone, when he spoke again, was laced with a fierce, almost desperate pride. "It is all there. My equations, my theories, my condemnation of a system that stifles genius and rewards mediocrity," Mr. Silas Appledore answered. He tapped the cover of the book with a trembling finger, his eyes shining with an almost fanatical light as he looked from the volume to Holmes. "I sought not an accomplice, Mr. Holmes, but an intellectual heir, or at the very least, a worthy adversary to comprehend my defiance," remarked Mr. Silas Appledore. As Appledore's words hung in the air, the wind outside rose to a mournful moan. The fire crackled, a log collapsing with a hiss and a shower of sparks, punctuating the tense atmosphere. The desire for recognition is a powerful motivator, Mr. Appledore. Yet the law makes little distinction for the motives behind a theft, however grand the perceived purpose. Sherlock Holmes noted. Appledore's voice turned sharp again, cutting with a fresh wave of resentment. He straightened his small frame as if to physically oppose Holmes's calm logic. "The law, the law is a construct of the very society I challenge," replied Mr. Silas Appledore. He took a defiant step forward, his fists clenched at his sides, his previous scholarly demeanor momentarily eclipsed by raw anger. What of the theft of potential, Mr. Holmes? The slow strangulation of a mind by mundane servitude? Is there no crime in that? Holmes was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him. I could see the conflict within him, the detective bound by duty, and the intellect that could not help but acknowledge the extraordinary mind, however warped its path, that stood before him. The full scope of Appledore's intellectual rebellion was now laid bare, and it presented a far more complex problem than a simple case of embezzlement. He cleared his throat, his patience clearly exhausted. Well, Mr. Holmes, are we to stand here all night discussing philosophy, or shall I take this genius into custody? Replied Constable Grimshaw. The question hung heavy in the air, the crackling fire the only sound for a tense beat. Holmes's eyes met Appledore's, a silent acknowledgment passing between two formidable intellects, one on either side of the law's stark divide. The next move, I knew, would determine more than just Appledore's immediate fate. Appledore had confessed. The weight of his crime, set against his bold intellect, still filled the air. Then we heard the measured footsteps of officials on the landing. They approached the bank manager's office, where Holmes had finally cornered Appledore. Mr. Holmes, the gruff voice preceded its owner into the room. Thurston said you'd have our man. Constable Grimshaw's gaze settled on the quiet figure of Silas Appledore. Responded Constable Grimshaw. Appledore offered no resistance. A strange calm had settled upon him. It seemed the unburdening of his mind, and his intellectual contest with Holmes had brought him a fleeting peace. The missing funds were recovered from a cleverly hidden compartment in his modest lodgings. They were precisely accounted for, as detailed in his own complex ledger. This ledger was a testament to a mind that meticulously planned even its downfall. From the outer office, the brief clatter of a strongbox being secured by one of Grimshaw's men echoed. It was a final, metallic end to Appledore's desperate gamble. As Grimshaw prepared to lead Appledore away, Holmes spoke, his tone unusually grave. "Constable," he said, "ensure Mr. Appledore's papers, his mathematical treatises are handled with care. They are not mere ramblings. They are work of potential significance," observed Sherlock Holmes. Grimshaw grunted, looking mildly bewildered. "Significant, Mr. Holmes?" he asked. "They look like gibberish to me, but if you say so, sir. Evidence is evidence, I suppose," Constable Grimshaw said. Holmes's eyes held a different light. They acknowledged the tragedy of a brilliant mind so tragically misapplied. He had seen the intricate beauty within those equations and the desperate plea for recognition woven into their complex fabric. I knew he sought to salvage this from the wreckage of Appledore's ambition. Weeks later, the embezzler's equation affair had mostly faded from the penny press, replaced by new sensations. Yet, its echoes lingered within our familiar rooms at 221 B. Baker Street. The Dilettante Detectives Club now convened there with a new sobriety. The usual cheerful clatter of teacups was more subdued. Members' faces were thoughtful as they listened to Holmes. Outside, evening had fallen. The distant rumble of a late omnibus on Baker Street provided a familiar sound to our discussion. Mr. Abernathy, usually a boisterous fellow, spoke with quiet contemplation. His voice was softer than I had known it. "It is a sobering business, Mr. Holmes," he said. "To think such a mind could be driven to such ends," remarked Mr. Abernathy. Holmes nodded, his fingers steepled. "Indeed, Mr. Abernathy," he replied. "Appledore's case clearly shows an intellect constrained. It shows ambition spoiled by circumstance and lack of outlet. He did not seek mere wealth, you see. The equation he left was not just a puzzle to hide his spoils. It was a challenge, a demand to be understood by an equal. His manifesto, recovered with the funds, made that very clear," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He paused. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle hiss of the gaslight. I saw the members exchange glances. They were beginning to grasp the deeper currents Holmes had navigated. Miss Evans spoke, her voice tinged with melancholy, yet hinting at her usual admiration for cleverness. "So," she ventured, "his crime was almost secondary to his desire for intellectual acknowledgement," replied Miss Evans. Holmes affirmed with a slight nod. "Precisely, Miss Evans," he said. "The funds were a means, not the ultimate end. His true ambition was to have his theories validated, his genius recognized. Society had failed him, or perhaps he had failed to navigate society. The line is often finer than we perceive," explained Sherlock Holmes. Clearly, the club members had learned much from this peculiar case. Their initial thrill of the chase had matured. They now had a deeper understanding of human nature and the complex interplay of circumstance, character, and crime. Their questions were more incisive. Their observations were more nuanced than when they first gathered, eager for any mystery. "And Appledore's papers, Holmes?" I inquired, my voice reflecting the group's curiosity. "Will they see the light of day?" responded Dr. John Watson. Holmes's expression softened, a rare sight that always struck me. "I have spoken to a colleague at Cambridge," he explained, "a man with considerable mathematical skill. He has expressed a cautious interest. Appledore's name may yet be known for something beyond embezzlement. Justice, Watson, is not always a simple matter of guilt and punishment. Sometimes it means preserving a spark of brilliance, even from the ashes of a ruined life," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He leaned back. Firelight played upon his keen features. I reflected that the Dilettante Detectives Club had transformed, much like Holmes's own view on the complexities of human effort. The enigma of Silas Appledore was solved. More than that, it had illuminated the shadowed pathways of the human mind. It left us all with a deeper appreciation for both the price and the potential of brilliance. The case was closed, yet I felt its lessons would resonate for a long time.